One evening in April of 2006, a person sat at their kitchen table frantically cutting up the page of a newspaper with some scissors. They were working on a very important project, and it was almost done. They finished cutting up the final letter from the page and pasted it onto the sheet of paper. Then they leaned back to read the message that they'd assembled from the scraps. It was a warning, and they were sure it would have exactly the effect they were hoping for. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. On Sunday afternoon, March 12, 2006, 39-year-old Michael Zamiti Jr. drove his ATV across a frozen lake in Freedom, New Hampshire. And even though it was really cold and the air burned his cheeks and his lungs, Mike smiled as he drove. He really just loved it here. Most of the time, Mike lived 2 hours away in the town of Wakefield, Massachusetts. But he'd been coming to Freedom, New Hampshire for years because his parents had a vacation house here. And so this tiny lakeside community had always felt like a second home and a peaceful retreat. And Mike had recently bought his own vacation house in Freedom, just down the street from his parents. And the purchase had been a really big deal for him. He ran a cement contracting company called Allstate Concrete Pumping, and he'd worked really hard for many years to build up a nice life for his wife Michelle and their 3 kids. And in many ways, the purchase of the second house was proof that he'd done it. But his work with the concrete company had also created some issues in his marriage. Being in charge of a company meant a lot of responsibility and long hours. So Michelle and the kids were on their own quite a bit, which meant Michelle had to do most of the parenting and most of the household stuff. And she'd recently made it clear that Mike being gone all the time, despite how successful he was still really hard on her. Now, out on the lake, as Mike was kind of thinking about his whole life, Mike could see another ATV coming toward him. And as it got closer, he could see that the driver of the ATV was the other problem in his marriage, Sean Fitzpatrick. So Sean was one of their neighbors on the lake, and he'd been a close friend of the family for years. He was retired, and he lived in Freedom year-round, and when the Zamitis were there, he'd come over for dinners or barbecues or to take their kids boating out on the lake. He was around so much that Mike's kids actually called him Uncle Sean. But last summer, Mike had found out that his wife Michelle had cheated on him with Sean. Mike had been obviously completely devastated, but he and Michelle had both agreed not to give up on their marriage and had been going to therapy together ever since. And in terms of Mike and Sean's relationship, well, Mike still hadn't actually spoken to Sean since finding out about the affair, because mostly he just hated confrontation. It had been easier for him to avoid Sean and focus on rebuilding his relationship with Michelle. So seeing Sean now made Mike want to just turn around and speed off in the other direction. But Mike could see that Sean was already waving him down, so he came to a stop and waited there as Sean pulled his ATV up. And Sean did not beat around the bush. He immediately told Mike that he was glad he ran into him here because he'd been wanting to apologize about last summer and Michelle. It obviously wasn't okay, and he hoped they could just, put it behind them. And Mike, he was so surprised by how sincere Sean was being that he just said, you know what, it's all good. Which he didn't mean, because it definitely was not okay. But again, Mike's not a confrontational guy. All Mike really wanted to do here was get out of this interaction and get away from Sean, because this made him really uncomfortable. And also, he genuinely did need to leave basically right now, because he and Michelle and the kids were getting ready to head back to Wakefield soon, and he wanted to go help Michelle pack up. And so pretty quickly, Mike told Sean that he really had to go here. And then before, Sean could protest, Mike turned his ATV around and he gunned it back across the lake towards his house. About 15 minutes later, Mike walked into his house, and the first thing he saw was a bunch of suitcases all packed and sitting by the door. And he realized that, Michelle had already done all the work. But seconds later, Michelle came in and gave Mike a kiss. And she said, the kids were just finishing up cleaning their rooms and they could all head out in a few minutes. And then Mike heard the sound of a car beeping twice outside. And when he and his wife heard that, Michelle kind of rolled her eyes and laughed, because they both knew it was clearly Mike's parents. His parents had also been in Freedom for this weekend at their house down the street, and they were also making the 2-hour drive back to Wakefield this afternoon. And Michelle was laughing because it amused her that neither Mike nor his father could manage to go a single day without talking to each other. So Mike's dad was also named Michael, and the name was not the only thing they shared. They were also best friends and co-workers. Michael Sr. owned the company that Mike ran, Allstate Concrete. So it was like a family operation, and Mike Jr. had never even thought of doing anything else. He jumped into the concrete business right out of high school, and he and his dad had been working together ever since. Now, the Allstate Concrete Company had had some struggles, just like any company would, including a lawsuit from a former employee that had been pretty stressful. But for the most part, the business was a huge success, and right now they were busier than ever, working on an enormous construction project in nearby Boston. So Mike headed outside to say hi to his parents and to talk a little business with his dad. He asked Mike Sr. if he'd called their employee, Chester Roberts, yet, because Mike and his dad had plans to be at the office first thing tomorrow morning, and Mike wanted Chester to be there too. Chester worked part-time for them as a driver and also handyman, and he was easily the most reliable employee that they had. So whenever they had a packed week ahead, they always called Chester in. And to Mike Jr.'s relief, Mike Sr. said yes, he'd already spoken to Chester, and they were good to go. So eventually, they all said their goodbyes, and Mike Jr. told his dad he would see him tomorrow. Just before 8 a.m. the next morning, Monday, March 13th, Mike Jr. pulled his truck into the parking lot of Allstate Concrete. He was right on time. He could see he was the first vehicle there, so he got out and hustled across the lot because it was raining, and he unlocked a side door by one of the garage doors. So the Allstate building was basically just a massive garage with 3 huge roll-up doors for their cement trucks to pull into. But it also had an upstairs office where Mike and his father did all their administrative work. And so after Mike went in through the side door into the big garage, he headed up a set of steps that led to his office on the second level. And when he got there, he sat in his desk chair and started going over the week's logistics. And just a few minutes later, he heard another vehicle pull into the lot outside. Mike figured that very likely this was his father, because Chester often came to the office on foot. Then Mike Jr. heard the downstairs door open and footsteps coming up the stairs. A few minutes later, Mike's father, Mike Sr., pulled his truck into the Allstate Concrete parking lot and parked next to his son's truck. He hopped out and walked quickly to the building's side door to get out of the rain, but when he tried to push open the side door, it got stuck on something and wouldn't open all the way. So he looked through the crack to see what was blocking the door, and he froze, because there was clearly a man lying face down inside of the building in a huge pool of blood. Now, it was dark inside the building, and so Michael Sr. could not see the man's face. He had no idea who this guy was. But whoever it was, he knew sort of instinctively that it was not his son. Mike Jr. was a big guy, and even in the dark, it was clear this man had a different build. And so Michael Sr.'s heart was pounding now, and all he could think to do was just back away, grab his cell phone, and call 911. However, after Michael Sr. got off the phone with the dispatcher and they said they were sending people over now, Mike Sr. realized he couldn't just wait for the police to get there. I mean, there was clearly someone either very badly hurt or dead in his garage, and his son was likely somewhere inside too. I mean, his truck was here, and so he had to go in and make sure his son was okay. So Michael Sr. walked away from the blocked door where he had been standing when he called the police, and he pulled up one of the big roll-up garage doors. And once it was open, he didn't see anyone. He just ran inside and began frantically screaming his son's name. But Mike Jr. didn't answer, and there was no sign of him anywhere. So eventually, Mike Sr. ran to the staircase and went up to the second-floor office. And as soon as Mike Sr. barged into the office, he stopped in horror, because there, sitting slumped in the desk chair, was the blood-covered body of his son. Over an hour later, Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker pulled up in front of Allstate Concrete. He could see the large building was already roped off with caution tape, and there were a dozen or more crime scene techs and officers with the Wakefield Police Department who were moving in and out of an open garage door collecting evidence. So Baker was not a part of the Wakefield Police Department. He was with the state police. But in Massachusetts, state troopers conduct homicide investigations right alongside local authorities. And Baker had a feeling that this case would definitely need his help, because Wakefield, they didn't get many homicides. The town was about 10 miles north of Boston and had a reputation as being a really peaceful and safe place, the kind of small town where everyone actually knew each other. Baker got out of his cruiser and looked around for whoever was in charge. And he didn't have to wait long, because an officer hurried up to him and introduced himself as Detective Richard Cass with the Wakefield Police Department. Cass told Baker to follow him, and as they walked towards the open garage door, he quickly briefed Baker up on the situation. There were 2 male victims inside, and both were deceased. They'd both been shot, and they had been found by the company's owner, Michael Zametti Sr., a little after 8 a.m. Baker followed Cass into the garage and over to the first body. which was face down on the floor just inside a smaller side door. Cass explained that this victim was 51-year-old Chester Roberts, a part-time truck driver for Allstate. It hadn't been difficult to identify him because Chester did a lot of handiwork around town and was known by all the locals, including Detective Cass himself. When Baker went to the body, he could tell right away that Chester had been shot in the back. It was a single shot and most likely was from a shotgun, since clearly there was a blast radius where there was like a spray effect with a lot of little pellets that entered his body. Chester had no other visible injuries, including no defensive injuries. And when Baker stood and looked around the garage, he also didn't see anything that pointed to a robbery or any kind of struggle. There was pretty pricey looking equipment just sitting around, and nothing was toppled over or obviously out of place. So Baker guessed that Chester's killer had likely snuck up on him and shot him in the back before he even had a chance to turn around. Baker spent a couple more minutes looking around at the doors and the windows, and again, didn't see any signs of, forced entry or anything out of the ordinary, but that didn't mean much. Chester had likely opened up for the day and begun work, and the killer had just come in after him. And so after a few minutes, when Baker was done looking around the first floor, he told Cass he was ready to go up to the second floor to see the second body. Moments later, Cass led Baker into the second-floor office, where the body of 39-year-old Mike Zimetti Jr. had been found. Detective Cass said sadly that, just like with Chester, he knew Mike personally as well. Mike Jr. had not just been shot in the torso the way Chester had been shot. He had been shot in the face as well as in the chest. And the force of these shots had been so powerful that, like his desk and surrounding paperwork were also all drenched in blood, and for the most part, Mike was basically unrecognizable. But what struck Baker the most was not just how gruesome this was. It was the fact that, Mike Jr. is still kind of slumped in his chair. He's in his office. Whoever did this, it's like they went in here to execute Mike, really intentionally. They marched in here, they didn't touch anything else, and they shot Mike right in the face with a shotgun before Mike could even get up. I mean, this seemed very intentional. Somebody came here to kill Mike. And so as Baker was thinking about that, he realized that this likely meant Mike Jr. was the one who actually got shot first, before Chester had even arrived at the building. Otherwise, Mike Jr. would have heard the gunshot downstairs, and he wouldn't have been so caught off guard sitting in his chair like this. And so again, if Mike was the first person shot, it just further suggested that he was the main target of this attack. The crime scene, of course, was gruesome, but considering it was remarkably clean. I mean, there were no bloody footprints or any indication the killer had interacted with the scene. And the Zimettis did fit the Mafia stereotype, an Italian-American family involved in construction. Baker told Cass what he was thinking, sort of as he was surveying the scene here. And Cass, as he heard this, he sort of had this thoughtful look come over his face. He said he knew the Zimettis pretty well, and Mike Jr. and his father were really good people. So he found it hard to believe they were involved in any kind of shady, mafia business deals. But he conceded that it was possible, especially since the Zimettis were contractors on a project called The Big Dig. And this made Baker immediately raise his eyebrows. So The Big Dig was literally the biggest construction project in the country and involved building a tunnel under the harbor in Boston. But it had been kind of like a total disaster, just a major headache for the city since it was way over budget and had been going on for 15 years and still wasn't done. This huge project had also been famously hampered by mafia dealings and corrupt payoffs. So now Baker had to wonder if the Zimettis had either been involved in these seedy deals or had maybe accidentally upset the wrong person while on the job. But even if the murders had nothing to do with the mob, Baker still thought it was very likely that the killer was somehow connected to their business. Somebody who maybe had worked at Allstate Concrete, or maybe who had been a client, and would know where Mike worked in the building, and that he'd be there early in the morning. And while the second victim, Chester, was probably not the primary target, Baker wasn't sure yet why he was also killed. He could have been killed because he was just at work at the wrong moment, or maybe he was wrapped up in the same conflict as the Zimettis. So for a moment, Baker just stood there staring at the scene, staring at the blood-soaked paperwork all over the desk. And then eventually he turned to Cass and said they would need a list of all of Allstate's employees and clients. Baker then spent some more time just kind of walking around the office looking for evidence. and he noticed a 16-gauge shotgun shell on the floor. So he grabbed a nearby tech and told her to bag it and see if she could locate any other shells. Baker and Cass then headed outside, where already a crowd of people were gathering outside around the outside of the police perimeter. Once they were outside, Trooper Baker asked Cass if they could start by speaking with the person who actually discovered the bodies, Michael Zimetti Sr. But Detective Cass shook his head and said no. He explained when he'd first gotten to the scene that Michael Sr. had been so distraught over his son's death that he could barely speak, so Cass had just sent him home. Another Wakefield police officer had done the same thing when Mike Jr.'s wife, Michelle Zimetti, showed up, totally hysterical, saying she had heard there was an accident, and they had told her that her husband was dead and taken her home too. Baker understood, but was not thrilled to hear this. He preferred to speak to witnesses and family really quickly and in person. In a murder, a spouse is always a suspect, so he was especially disappointed to have missed Michelle. But there was still plenty to do at the scene, and obviously the Wakefield police knew where the family could be found later. So Baker turned to Cass and suggested they just start canvassing the businesses nearby. The following morning, March 14th, Trooper Baker parked his car in front of Mike's parents' house in Wakefield. He was with Detective Cass, and they were there to speak with Mike Sr. They'd just gotten the autopsies back for both Chester and Mike, but they didn't reveal anything that they didn't already know. Chester had been shot once, Mike twice, and both died likely within seconds. But the investigators did have one potential lead from their canvass of the neighborhood. Even though they hadn't found any surveillance cameras at Allstate Concrete, some businesses around Allstate had some. So Baker had some officers scrubbing through that footage now. He also had another team interviewing Chester Roberts' family, because there was still a chance that Baker had gotten this all wrong and maybe Chester was actually the target. Besides that, the crime techs had not found much physical evidence at the scene. There were no fingerprints, and since it had been raining, they hadn't been able to collect any footprints or car tracks from outside. So now, Baker reached up and knocked on the front door of the Zimetti's house, hoping that Mike Sr. would be able to point them in the right direction. A minute later, Baker and Cass sat in the living room with Mike Sr. and Pat, Mike's mom. Both of Mike's parents seemed incredibly emotional. Michael Sr. was visibly shaking, while Pat just cried. And seeing how upset they were now made Baker realize that Cass had made the right call in sending Michael Sr. home yesterday. Even 24 hours later, it was still going to be very hard to get any sort of real answer out of them because of how upset they were. So Baker decided he would just have to keep it really brief. The first thing he did is he asked Mike Sr. to just go over the actual discovery of the bodies. Tell me what happened. And what he said lined up with everything that Baker had heard from Cass and from dispatch. And so after Mike Sr. went over that, Baker moved on to the real reason he was there. He asked if there was anybody in Mike Jr.'s life who might have wanted to hurt him. Mike Sr. took a few shaky breaths as he thought about the question, and then he said that, there were a few people in the industry that he and his son did not necessarily get along with, but mostly they tried to have good relationships with everyone. Getting in fights was just bad business. But as he was saying this, Mike Sr. suddenly sat up straighter, like he just thought of something. And he said, actually, there was a former coworker who did definitely have a grudge against them. His nephew, Hank Jennings. Hank got mad at them a few years ago about unpaid overtime wages and actually filed a lawsuit against them. Now, they'd eventually paid Hank a settlement, but they still all hated each other. Mike Sr. looked over at his wife, Pat, and she just nodded and said the whole thing had been really high stress and very volatile. Baker took down Hank's information and talked with Mike's parents for just a few more minutes, and then he nodded to Cass, and they stood to leave. Baker knew he still needed to speak more to the Zimettis, but for now, he was going to give them a break, and instead, he and Cass would look into Hank. 2 days later, Baker sat in Cass's office at the Wakefield Police Department, poring over crime scene photos and witness statements. He was starting to get antsy. After meeting with Mike's parents, he'd been excited to speak with Hank Jennings, the disgruntled former employee who also happened to be Mike's cousin. But even though Baker and Cass had sent officers out to track Hank down for an interview, they hadn't been able to get a hold of him yet. However, they had gotten in touch with Mike's wife, Michelle, and had questioned her at her house in Wakefield, but she hadn't given them much. She said that she was at home with her kids at the time of her husband's death, and that she really didn't know of anybody who would want to hurt Mike Jr. Also, Baker and Cass had looked into Allstate Concrete's financial statements, and they had found nothing that suggested there was anything shady or mafia-related happening with the company. Still, Baker knew they were better off than they had been a few days ago, primarily because they had had a chance to review a bunch of the surveillance footage from the businesses around Allstate, and one of those security cameras had been aimed at the street right outside Allstate. Now, this angle didn't show the Allstate parking lot itself, but it did show everyone who entered and exited that parking lot from the street. So, this particular camera had picked up Mike Jr.'s truck arriving at work at 7:39 a.m., and then at 7:44 a.m., so 5 minutes later, an unknown green pickup truck pulled in as well. And then a few minutes after that, Chester Roberts was seen arriving at Allstate on foot. And then at 7:50, the green truck was seen again, leaving the parking lot, 12 minutes before Michael Sr.'s red truck arrived at 8:02. So, whoever the killer was, it looked like they had driven that green truck and had killed Mike and Chester between 7:44 a.m. and 7:50 a.m. The video wasn't clear enough to show the driver of this mysterious green truck or even see its plates, and it didn't actually show the driver of this vehicle, the killer, getting out of the vehicle and entering the building. But knowing the style and color of very likely the killer's vehicle would definitely help them narrow down potential suspects. Just then, the desk phone rang, and Baker watched as Cass grabbed it and said hello. And then Cass got a confused look on his face before he thanked the caller and said they'd be right over. He hung up and told Baker that was Michelle Zametti, and she'd called to say that she had new information to give them, something that she hadn't mentioned in her first interview, and that it was really important. About 15 minutes later, Baker and Cass sat down across from Michelle in her living room for the second time. And to Baker, Michelle seemed very different from the last time they spoke. 2 days ago, she'd seemed horrified and grief-stricken. But now, she just seemed really nervous. She kept touching her hair and fiddling with a stack of condolence cards on the coffee table. Baker commented that there were a lot of cards, and Michelle just nodded. She said so many people had reached out and sent cards, all their friends and neighbors in Wakefield and in Freedom, New Hampshire, where their second home was. And then Michelle took a breath and just got straight to the reason that she had called them. She said that she had withheld information about one of her neighbors in Freedom. His name was Sean Fitzpatrick, and she'd had an affair with him. Baker cleared his throat in surprise and then asked her to go on. Michelle's eyes filled with tears as she explained how Mike Jr. worked so much and she and the kids spent a lot of time at their lake house, and so that meant they spent a lot of time with Sean. And eventually this friendship between Michelle and Sean had grown into a romance. Baker couldn't believe he was hearing this. A secret love triangle gave both Sean and Michelle plenty of motivation to want Mike dead. But before he could ask any follow-up questions, Michelle said her husband actually knew all about her affair, and that they had been in therapy, and they'd begun to completely turn their marriage around. So finally, a month ago, she'd officially totally broken things off with Sean, and Sean had been really upset about it. Baker shared a look with Cass and could tell they were both thinking the same thing. Obviously, they needed to speak to Sean immediately. But also, Michelle was now back to being a primary suspect too. Maybe she had wanted her husband out of the picture so she could be with Sean, and maybe the only reason she was telling them this was to get ahead of it. However, they would need a lot more evidence before they could prove any of that. So for now, Baker just got Sean's number and address from Michelle and told her they would be in touch. Later that night, Baker and Cass were once again inside of Cass's office, but this time they were there with another officer who was there to give them a crucial update. After speaking with Michelle, Baker had sent a team of officers up to Freedom, New Hampshire to speak with Sean, the neighbor she had been having an affair with. And now, one of those officers was back in Wakefield to tell them what he had learned. And the first thing Baker wanted to know was not about their conversation. It was just, did you see a green truck in Sean's driveway? But the officer shook his head and said Sean did own a truck, but it was bright red. Then he went on to say that when they had spoken to Sean, he had completely denied having an affair with Michelle. Sean had admitted that he had dated a lot of girls, but he'd insisted that he and Michelle were just close family friends. Now, the officers who were there speaking to Sean just stood there and let Sean talk. never telling him that they already knew that Michelle fully admitted to them having an affair, and they knew Sean was lying here. Baker almost laughed when he heard this, because he did not believe Sean at all. And if he was lying like he appeared to be, that made him seem pretty guilty. But before he could say so, the officer added one more thing. He said Sean actually had a solid alibi. He'd been at home on the morning of the murders, and one of his neighbors had actually confirmed it. This particular neighbor took her morning walk every day at 9 a.m., and she'd seen Sean outside his house right around then. Baker sighed. It took around 2 hours to drive between Freedom and Wakefield, so Sean would not have had enough time to kill Mike and Chester by 7:50 a.m. and then get to Freedom by 9. And so suddenly, Sean Fitzpatrick felt like another very promising dead end. On March 18th, so 5 days after the murders of Mike Zimetti and Chester Roberts, Detectives Baker and Cass stood at the back of a church in Wakefield, Massachusetts. They were there for Mike's funeral, and the church was absolutely packed. But the investigators were not just there to pay their respects. They were also there to speak to Hank Jennings, the cousin of Mike who had filed that lawsuit against the concrete company. Since by that point they still had not been able to officially get a hold of Hank, Cass had suggested that they just corner him at Mike's funeral, which he was very likely to attend because, despite his rift with the Zimettis, he was still family. And when the service wrapped up and everybody stood to leave, Baker felt a nudge on his arm. Cass leaned over and whispered that they'd been right, and he pointed out Hank right in the crowd. So, as the attendees started filing out of the church, the investigators pushed their way over to Hank and got in front of him just before he could step outside. Baker immediately noticed that Hank's whole body went tense when they blocked his way, like he wanted to try to make a run for it. So Baker just cut to the chase, and he said, "Hank, will you come with us and speak to us, please?" And Hank's eyes got really wide, and he just said, "No way, not without his lawyer." Then he pushed past the investigators and hurried outside. Baker and Cass didn't follow him. Instead, they just exchanged a look, because they knew now that Hank was obviously their primary suspect. 5 weeks after the funeral, in mid-April of 2006, State Trooper Kevin Baker sat in Detective Cass's office in the Wakefield Police Department. He was wearing gloves, and he was holding a piece of paper that looked like an old-fashioned ransom note. It was covered in letters that had been clearly cut out of a newspaper, and it spelled out a very alarming message. "Close business now, or more family will die." This message had been brought to them by Mike Jr.'s mother, Pat, who said they had received it in the mail that morning. For the Zimettis, for so many reasons, this letter was terrifying. It was not just a reminder of their son's murder, but also a promise that there would be more violence. But for Baker, the note was a lead, which they really needed, because it had been over a month since Michael and Chester were killed, and at this point, the two investigators had managed to rule out basically every one of their suspects, and that included Hank Jennings. They'd learned that Hank's clear reluctance to meet with them was not because of guilt. It was because he had signed a non-disclosure agreement during the settlement with the Zimettis and didn't want to break it. And when they did finally speak to him, he clearly had an alibi. He was at work when Mike and Chester were killed, and Baker and Cass had confirmed it with his employer. And while Hank did own some shotguns, none of them were 16 gauge. So Hank joined the pile of other discarded suspects, like Michelle, who could have had the motive to kill Mike Jr. since she was wrapped up in an affair with their neighbor, but she'd been incredibly cooperative, and they hadn't been able to find any evidence that she might have been involved, like maybe if she had hired someone or something. And her ex-lover, Sean, was also very suspicious and had a strong motive to kill Mike, but his alibi had cleared him. There was no way Sean could have been in Wakefield during the murders because his neighbor saw him about an hour later at his home, which was over 100 miles away. And so now this warning note that looked like a ransom note seemed to point back towards the theory that Baker and Cass had ruled out at the very beginning, that the murders were business-related and the Mafia was involved. Cass was a local, and he'd told Baker that there had been a lot of rumors swirling around about the murders in the community. Because of the Zimetti's role in the Big Dig, the general consensus around Wakefield was that the mob theory made the most sense. But Baker really wasn't so sure. I mean, they'd looked into the Zimetti's books and records repeatedly, and they hadn't seen anything to suggest any shady deals or potential mob interaction. Also, Baker didn't think this ransom-style note made from newspaper clippings was the mob style. It just felt kind of silly and performative. Like maybe somebody was trying to make it seem like the mob to lead the investigation in the wrong direction. But even if that was the case, this note was still huge, because maybe whoever had sent it had left their fingerprints or DNA on it. So Baker bagged up the note, and Cass carried it off to send to the crime lab. Baker knew the results from the lab would not be immediate, so while they waited, he wanted to re-interview all their suspects and all their witnesses in case they'd overlooked anything. A few days later, Baker sat alone at Cass's desk, reading another witness statement. He'd been revitalized by all the new evidence they'd gathered and was feeling really optimistic about their ability to solve this thing. Aside from conducting new interviews, they had gotten some forensics from that ransom letter. The lab had found both DNA and a palm print on it. Now, they just needed a suspect to compare it to. And just then, the office door flung open and a very excited Cass barged in. An hour later, Baker and Cass walked up the front steps at Michelle Zamidy's house, and they knocked on her front door. When she answered, they asked her for permission to come inside and take a certain small object from her house. And after Michelle, who was sort of confused by what they were asking for, said, "Okay, come on in," they went right past her, went straight to this object, they bagged it, went right back outside, and sent it off to the crime lab. And as soon as the lab test results came back, Baker and Cass knew they had solved the case. Based on DNA, other forensic evidence, and witness statements, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Michael Zamidy Jr. and Chester Roberts on the morning of March 13th, 2006. At 7:45 a.m., the killer crept up the stairs that led to Mike's office. They had a shotgun with them, and their heart was racing. They were very nervous about what they were about to do. But Mike Jr., he had to go, and that was all there was to it. So when the killer reached the office door, they barely hesitated before pushing it open and raising their shotgun. Mike was sitting in a chair at his desk, and when the door opened, he turned towards the killer. And when Mike Jr. saw them standing there with a gun pointed at them, his eyes got wide, but the killer fired 2 blasts before Mike could even move, hitting Mike in the face and in the chest. Mike immediately slumped over in his seat and stopped moving, and the killer ran back down the stairs to the garage. But before they could leave, they froze, because they could hear footsteps approaching the building's side door from outside. And so the killer instinctively just hid, not really sure what they were going to do, waiting for this person to either come inside or leave. And then once this person did come inside, it was a man, it was Chester, the killer leapt out and shot him right in the back, and he dropped to the ground, dead. And after killing Chester, the killer felt shocked. I mean, they hadn't planned on killing a second person today. Mike was the target. But they also knew they couldn't just wait around for more people to arrive. So the killer at this point left the building and jumped into the truck they had stolen from one of their neighbors. Then they peeled out of the parking lot less than just 10 minutes after they'd arrived. As they drove, they gripped the wheel tightly, and they knew they should feel guilty about what they had just done. But instead, all they felt was relief, because now they could finally be with the love of their life. It would turn out Michael Zamidy Jr. and Chester Roberts were not murdered by Mike's wife Michelle, or Mike Jr.'s cousin Hank, or the mob. They were killed by Mike Jr.'s lakeside neighbor and his wife's lover, Sean Fitzpatrick. When Michelle tried to break things off with Sean, she said the only reason she would ever leave Mike was if Mike ended things, or if something happened to him. Now, Michelle meant that as an excuse, but Sean took it as a suggestion. So then he murdered Mike Jr. to steal his wife. Sean took that green pickup truck from a neighbor who was out of town, and then drove it to Wakefield, committed the murders, and then came back. That neighbor, who said they saw Sean at his house in Freedom at around 9 a.m., that basically made it impossible for Sean, based on timing, to have gone, committed the murders, and came back. Well, that neighbor called to amend their statement, saying that actually they had seen Sean later in the day. And that change created enough time, enough of a window on the day of the murders, that it was absolutely possible that Sean could have driven, done the murders, and come back. And so once Sean's alibi fell apart, investigators remembered that stack of condolence cards at Michelle's house. So they went over to see if maybe Sean had sent one. And he had. And when they tested the envelope flap, which he had licked to seal it, they got his DNA. Then they matched it to the very threatening letter that sort of looked like a ransom letter that had been given to the Zimidis, which Sean had put together and sent to them in order to throw police off his trail and make them think that, yeah, the mob was involved here. In June of 2006, Sean Fitzpatrick was arrested and eventually received 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders of Michael Zimidi Jr. and Chester Roberts. On the afternoon of December 1st, 1999, a middle-aged man named Lee Hao was standing in the back office of a small restaurant in Decheng County, which is in southwestern China, when he suddenly heard somebody yelling in the seating area. They were screaming for the manager, and that was Lee. So he hurried out of the office to see what was going on. When he rounded the corner into the seating area, Lee immediately saw this customer sitting at a table with a plate of food in front of him, and he was slamming his fists against the table over and over again, and he was screaming that his food tasted so disgusting that even pigs wouldn't eat it. And hearing this, Lee felt totally exhausted and overwhelmed, because this was literally the 10th time today that a customer of his had complained about the food tasting bad. In fact, there had been so many complaints back to back to back that Lee hadn't even had time to speak to the chef and figure out what was going on here. And so Lee walked over to the customer's table and he bowed to show respect, and then he said he was so sorry for the inconvenience and told the man that his meal was on the house. When the door slammed shut behind him, Lee kind of just looked around the restaurant and he realized that his normally very busy restaurant was actually now completely deserted. And so Lee was totally frustrated and he just turned around, he marched to the back of the restaurant and he flung open the door that led to the kitchen. And right inside, he saw the chef standing at the counter, cutting up some vegetables. And Lee, by this point, was just so mad and frankly so worried about what was happening to his restaurant that when he got in there, he just started yelling at the chef. He told the chef that he better have a really good explanation for why everything he cooked that day had tasted so horrible. Otherwise, he was getting fired. But the chef immediately set his knife down and just put his hands up and was like, look, it's not my fault. He said he had also noticed that the food tasted really weird, but he didn't know why. All of his ingredients were fresh. He hadn't changed any of his recipes, like he didn't get it. However, the chef said he had talked to some other chefs who worked at different restaurants in the area, and they were saying the same thing, that people are saying their food tastes bad and they don't know why. So the chef said, like, whatever's going on here, it's affecting everybody. And so the next morning, Lee met up with a bunch of these other restaurant managers in the neighborhood to talk about the problems that they were all having with their food. And very quickly, he realized, one, it was true that these other restaurants were having this same issue. And two, they all learned that they were all sourcing one ingredient from the same place. And so they all figured that it was this ingredient that was the problem. And they needed to get together and call the supplier and figure out what was wrong. Later that same day, a man named Yang Guishou walked along a rugged dirt path up a steep hill not far from the restaurant that Lee managed. Yang worked for the supplier that Lee and the other restaurant managers had called. And now he was going to inspect this ingredient that they thought was making all of their food taste bad. And Yang admittedly really wasn't sure what to expect. The supplier he worked for didn't usually get any complaints, and the specific ingredient that these restaurant managers were worried about was normally very good. But Young did think it was possible that maybe the ingredient could have been tainted somehow. Maybe because rats had gotten into the building where they stored it or something. So Young hiked to the top of the hill where there was a tall concrete storage building. He climbed up a rusty metal ladder to the top of the building and then opened up a door and went inside. It was dark inside, which he expected, so he pulled out his flashlight and he turned it on. And he sort of expected to maybe see some rats, but when he looked around, he didn't see any. However, he did see something. Right beyond where he was standing, basically right inside this room, there was this large canvas bag that definitely should not have been in there. And so Yang, he just reached out instinctively and began to poke the bag, and something fell out of it. And for a second, Yang couldn't even process what he was seeing. But then all at once, he understood, and suddenly everything made sense. He scrambled out of the building, went down the ladder, and ran to go call the police. It would turn out the ingredient that all the restaurants had in common was their water. And so when Yang went into the water tower and saw that canvas bag, well, what came rolling out of it was a decomposing human head, which meant for 2 full weeks, every restaurant nearby had been cooking their food with water that was tainted by a rotting corpse. The police would later determine that the body belonged to a man from another town who had been robbed and killed by 3 members of an organized crime group. Those 3 men were found, they were arrested, found guilty, and sentenced to death. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. On the evening of March 5th, 1958, a 22-year-old man named Qasim bin Osman was eating dinner inside of his home in a small town in modern-day Malaysia when he suddenly heard somebody frantically pounding at his front door. Qasim was not expecting any guests, but he also wasn't really surprised by the noise, because Qasim was something called a bomo, which was basically like a shaman. He was very well known and highly respected in town, and so it was not unusual for people to show up at his house sort of unexpectedly, asking for help with various spiritual problems. So Qasim got up and he went to answer the door. And when he did, he saw 4 men standing on his porch, and he vaguely recognized them like he'd seen them around town before. One of the men introduced himself as Kaur Agwan, and Kaur said he needed Qasim's help because last night his wife had gone missing. He'd spent all day searching and still couldn't find her, and so he hoped that maybe Qasim could help. And when he heard this, Qasim felt a little bit uncomfortable. Generally speaking, he was very confident in his abilities as a healer, which was primarily what he did. He was like a spiritual healer. But he'd never helped find a missing person before. So Qasim was honest and told Kaur that he really didn't know if he could help, but he would try. And so Qasim invited all 4 men into his home, into his living room, and then while they were sitting down, he went into his supply room and he grabbed some matches and this large bowl that was filled with charcoal, and then with these supplies, he went back and met the group. Qasim then instructed everybody to sit in a circle on the floor. He explained that he was going to do a meditation ritual that was meant to help him clear his mind so he could tap into the energies around him. Ideally, he said, he would be able, through this process, to connect to Kaur's wife's energy so he could maybe find her. And so the group, after sitting down and sort of understanding the instructions, Qasim, he struck a match and then lit the charcoal on fire that was in this bowl. Then Qasim actually leaned his head over this, smoldering bowl of charcoal and began taking in these huge breaths of smoke. And he kept inhaling the smoke until he felt so lightheaded that he was about to pass out. And right as he's on the verge of losing consciousness, an image flashed through his mind. For a split second, what he saw was this light green field that seemed to extend, into infinity, just a massive green field. And so at this point, Qasim, he snapped his head back, stopped breathing in all the smoke, and he told Kaur and the other men that he knew where they needed to go. About 15 minutes later, Qasim, Kaur, and the other men walked into a light green field that was identical to the one Qasim had seen in his mind. It was a huge rice paddy right on the edge of town. And so when they got to this rice paddy, they split up and just began looking for, clues or maybe for Kaur's wife. They didn't even know. And very quickly, one of the men yells out that he's found something. And so Qasim and Kaur and the others, they join this guy and they look down and they see there's like this pile of straw that's covering something pretty sizable in the rice paddy. Eventually, one of the men reached down and began removing the straw, and at the base of it, underneath this big pile, was Cora's wife, and she was covered in blood, and she was dead. About 30 minutes later, a police officer named J.C. Sabui sat inside of an interview room at the police station with Cor, the dead woman's husband. By this point, Sabui had been briefed on the details of this case. He knew that Cor's wife had gone missing about 24 hours earlier, that the town Bomo had apparently had this vision that led them to the rice paddy where her body was found, and that officers had actually already determined that she'd been beaten to death. Now, Sabui was trying to hone in on potential suspects, and the victim's husband was the most obvious place to start. So Sabui asked Cor to tell him more about the circumstances around his wife's disappearance. Cor explained that the night before she had left on her own to go for a late-night walk and never came home. He said he didn't know of anybody who would have wanted to hurt her, but he did have a theory about her murder. He said his wife normally wore a lot of jewelry, but when he'd seen her body in the rice paddy, he'd noticed all of her jewelry was gone. So he wondered if maybe she'd been robbed. Sabui thought the idea that this woman just went on a random nighttime walk by herself right before she went missing and turned up dead, it just seemed sort of unlikely. And it also seemed like Cor was just really eager to throw suspicion off of himself. But the robbery angle also did sound plausible. I mean, turning up with no jewelry on when she normally wore jewelry suggests a robbery. So Sabui decided to follow up both on the husband and the robbery angle. And he and his team would spend the next 4 days searching for evidence against Cor and for this missing jewelry. But they came up totally empty. And so 96 hours into this investigation, they basically had nothing to show for it. And so as a result, he sort of felt desperate. And even though he didn't normally believe in the town Bomo's visions or magic, he felt like, it was one of his visions that led to this body. Maybe he actually is as good as he says he is. Why don't we ask him what he thinks? On the morning of March 9th, so this is 4 days after Cor's wife's body was found, Sabui knocked on the town Bomo's front door. And when Kasim answered, Sabui explained the situation about how, there was missing jewelry and maybe it was a robbery and they didn't know what. And they asked if Kasim would be willing to help, since, after all, he had already found the body. Now, Kasim was not particularly eager to be a part of this investigation. He openly said, I don't solve crimes. I'm a spiritual healer. But, he had to admit that he's already gotten involved. He's the one whose vision led to the finding of the body, and so he told Sabui that, of course, he would try. So Sabui watched as Kasim left the door and went into his house and then came back with a bowl of charcoal. And before long, Kasim had lit it on fire and was deeply inhaling the fumes coming off of it. And after a minute or two, when Kasim was totally messed up from breathing in all this smoke, he looked up and he said he's had another vision. And so he jumped up, he left his house and began walking down the street. And Sabui just followed right behind him. And Sabui watched as Kasim would stop in front of each house, and for a few moments he would just stare at the house. And then eventually he would just move on to the next one. Kasim looped all around town, just stopping and staring at all these houses for literally hours. And to Sabui, he was starting to feel like it was a mistake to bring Kasim in, because it just seemed like this isn't going anywhere. His ability to find the body happened pretty much right away. What is this? What is he doing? However, out of nowhere, Kasim stopped in front of yet another house, stared at it for a second, and then turned and told Sabui, this is where the jewelry is. And this actually made Sabui feel very intrigued. Because of all the houses that he thought Kasim might eventually stop in front of and suggest there was some clue inside, let alone the jewelry inside, this particular house had never entered Sabui's mind. So given the weirdness of where they now were standing, Sabui called for backup. And then he and a team of officers searched this house. And lo and behold, they found Cor's wife's missing jewelry inside, just like Kasim had said. And so despite Sabui's, growing skepticism around what Kasim can actually do, this was now the second time that Kasim had sort of had this big breakthrough in the case from his visions. That was incredible. But the problem was, the house that Kasim had led them to, where the jewelry was Kasim's own house. It would turn out Cor's wife really did go on a walk by herself on the night she disappeared. But during that walk, she passed by Kasim's house. And when she did, Qasim attacked and killed her and then stole her jewelry and hid her body in the rice paddy. Apparently, he thought pretending to help with the investigation would make him look innocent. But the police quickly realized he wasn't magical, he was just guilty. After his arrest, Qasim would give a full confession, and he was ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to death. At 8 a.m. on August 22, 1974, a young man named Leo Feng sat on a long bench inside of a public mortuary in Hong Kong. He was sitting with about a dozen of his closest family members, and they were all facing the front of the room, looking at an open wooden coffin. Inside of the coffin was the body of Feng's older sister, 34-year-old Liu Fumin. Today was her funeral, and it was supposed to be a time for Feng and his family to come together and privately mourn their loss. But they couldn't do that because they were literally outnumbered by the amount of newspaper reporters who were also in the room. And the reporters were milling around, taking notes, and even taking pictures of the body in the coffin. And this really upset Feng, because in his mind, the reporters were not treating his sister like a person. They were treating her like, the salacious headline she'd become ever since her death. So 1 week earlier, Feng's sister, Fumin, had been found strangled to death in a hotel room in Hong Kong. She had clearly been murdered. But that was not what had made her case such big news. What had made it news was the fact that Fumin had been found without her face. Her killer had cut off her eyebrows, her eyelids, her nose, and her lips. And so now, as she lay in her open coffin, she looked grotesque. Since she didn't have eyelids, it looked like she was staring straight up at the ceiling with these huge glassy eyes, and without lips, it looked like she was baring her teeth in this horrible, morbid smile. But for Feng and probably the rest of his family, the worst part of all of this was not even, the media attention. It was the police response. They hadn't arrested anyone for the crime yet. His sister's murder was still unsolved. And so as Feng is watching these reporters mill about, treating his sister like she's just some, freak show, and he's thinking about how disrespectful her killer was to her body and how the police seemed so incompetent, it made him just so mad. But there was one thing that did bring him comfort, and that was the fact that he had actually come up with a plan that he believed would help him solve his sister's murder. And today, he was going to put that plan into action. Feng sat quietly with his family throughout the funeral service and tried his best to ignore the reporters. And then finally, when it was time for everybody to say their final goodbyes to his sister, Feng walked up to the front of the room, he reached into the pocket of his jacket, and he pulled out a giant knife. The next evening, on August 23rd, a police officer was doing her regular nighttime patrol through a neighborhood in Hong Kong that was not very far from where Liu Fumin's funeral had been held the day before. And as this policewoman was walking along, she glanced down an alleyway and she saw something that made her immediately stop in her tracks. There was a guy who was just laying on the ground, basically laying in this limp heap. And when she walked up to him, she could see there was blood all over him, and some of his limbs were twisted and contorted and obviously broken. I mean, he looked like he had fallen from a great height. The policewoman immediately called an ambulance and then ran to the man's side. And sort of unbelievably, she found he was still alive. And so she asked him what happened. And the guy, who's obviously in pain, he just kind of looked up towards the building right next to them. And as he's looking up, he said a woman had pushed him. When more officers arrived on the scene, they went to search for this woman who apparently was up on the roof. But there was no evidence of a woman or any kind of struggle at all anywhere on the top of the building or in the top floors of the building. There just was no sign that anything had happened. It was not until the police went to the hospital and re-interviewed the injured man, and he gave them a fuller statement about exactly who this woman was, that they understood why. It all had to do with Leo Feng, the brother of the murdered woman, and what he had done with that knife at her funeral. So when the injured man sort of came to in the hospital and he had stabilized a little bit and the police showed up and asked him to give more information about who pushed him off the roof, this was his description of the woman who pushed him.
He said she had these big, horrible, glassy eyes and this awful, toothy grin, and she had no eyebrows, she had no eyelids, her nose was gone, her lips were gone. She looked horrifying. Obviously, he was basically describing the murdered woman, Liu Fumin, but she was dead, like literally dead when he got pushed off the roof. And so the police are like, that's not possible. A dead woman could not have pushed you off the roof. But wait, her brother, the murdered victim's brother, Liu Feng, at the funeral when he pulled out that knife, he then went on to perform this ancient Taoist ritual where he stabbed the knife into his sister's wooden coffin, which he believed would unleash her spirit so it could go find and take revenge on her killer. And apparently, it worked. Because the man in the alleyway, after describing effectively the ghost of this murdered woman, then gave a full confession saying he was her killer. He would say that the reason he did it is because she rejected his marriage proposal. Fumin's killer was ultimately arrested, convicted of manslaughter, and sentenced to 10 years in prison.
One afternoon in early September of 2004, 20-year-old Derek Keeper sat at a desk in the newspaper lab at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, furiously typing on one of the school's desktop computers. The lab that Derek was in was the hub of the university's school paper, the Daily Nebraskan. So there were some other students who were in the space that were talking or working at other computers. But Derek didn't notice any of them. He was completely locked in on what he was doing and writing as fast as he could. Because after he was done with the article that he was working on, he had a ton of other responsibilities that he needed to tackle. So Derek was involved in a lot of stuff at school. He was in a fraternity, he was a senator in the student government, he was a research assistant for the library, and he was pursuing 5 different majors. And Derek took all of his various commitments very, very seriously. But the column he was currently writing was really the one he had the most fun with. So Derek was from a small city in Nebraska, and even though he'd always been, personally a very loud and opinionated person, he'd never had a real platform for talking about all the ideas and points of views that he had. And so this column really gave him the opportunity to finally, actually present these big ideas to the students at school, and he hoped would likely provoke lively discussions around campus about his ideas. After all, Derek loved a good debate, and so he would intentionally choose to write about really complex issues that would get his readers fired up, like the ongoing war in Iraq and the future of the Republican Party and all the things that were wrong with local politics. The tone he went for when he wrote and talked about these kind of, contentious things was often very sarcastic, very blunt, and provocative. He really thrived on creating discourse and getting people to passionately disagree with him. And they usually definitely did, to the point where some even would get very mad with him. A lot of times the paper's readers would write furious letters or even send hate mail about what Derek had written. But Derek was really not bothered by that at all. In some ways, that was his aim, to get people all riled up. And he was sure that the article he was writing right now was going to be even more divisive than really anything else he had written. For Derek, though, really for him, it was all about individual freedoms and encouraging people to say no to government overreach in their daily lives. That really was sort of his general stance on everything. That's really what inspired him to do any of this in the first place. In fact, this particular column that Derek was writing was about how he was advocating for abolishing a set of state and federal laws that were trying to control personal choice and the right to decide what was best for one's body, and he was against it. Now, to be clear, the stakes for this issue were life and death, literally. But Derek believed that the fundamental freedom of being an American was the right to make your own decisions, even if it meant risking your own personal safety. And so as Derek sort of furiously typed away, he was encouraging everyone, like senators and politicians, everybody, to have the same kind of intensity that he had about this issue, to be just fully bought in on this idea of, as Americans, we need individual freedom. And then finally, when he was all done typing, Derek sat back and proofread the whole thing, and when he got to the last line, he got chills. It said, quote, I just wish we could keep the government out of our pocketbooks and out of our personal decisions. Derek loved that line, and so he nodded, satisfied with his work. He had nailed it. Then he emailed his draft to his editor with a big smile on his face. Derek's article went to print just a few days later, on September 17th. And like most of Derek's other articles, this one for sure got a lot of angry emails and letters from people who disagreed with what Derek had to say. But all the vitriol in these messages just proved to Derek that his article had clearly been a success. He had sparked outrage and got people talking about this issue. Derek even hoped that maybe some of the readers got angry enough to actually take action. That's what he wanted. He wanted his writing to genuinely inspire. The rest of Derek's semester was a total blur. He kept writing his weekly column on top of all of his other obligations and exams and everything else, and before he knew it, the semester was over, and he was headed to his mother's house in Texas for Christmas break. A few weeks later, on January 4th, 2005, at 3 a.m., Derek rode in the back seat of a Ford Explorer SUV on his way back to school after the break. He'd caught a ride from his mother's home in Texas with two of his fraternity brothers who were sitting up front. And Derek had spent the first part of this just awful 13-hour-long drive doing what he did best, using his sarcasm to make his friends laugh, and he was also engaging them in really animated conversations. And so, the first 6 to 8 hours had sort of flown by. But now, it's basically the middle of the night still, / very early morning, and everybody had just gone quiet because they were all exhausted from this truly awful, long drive. All any of them wanted to do at this point was just get back to campus and be done. And eventually, Derek and his friends were very close to campus. They were finally in Nebraska, and they were driving down Interstate 80, which was a snowy, cold highway not far from the school. And Derek was really excited to start the new semester. He'd had a nice, laid-back holiday where he'd caught up on sleep and spent a lot of time just kind of hanging out and seeing his younger siblings. But Derek just was not the kind of person who liked slowing down for very long. And so he was quite eager to get back to his busy life on campus. Especially, he really wanted to get back to his column. He had had a lot of downtime and was able to, brainstorm and come up with some good potential new topics for the column. But he really wasn't sure if any of those ideas were going to top the very controversial article that he had published back in September. People were still talking about that one. And Derek was still thinking about it too. In fact, his own words and advice to his readers were still ringing in his ears and guiding his everyday decisions. But for now, Derek just leaned his head up against the cold glass window of the car and waited for this long trip to finally be over. But suddenly, he felt the SUV lurch. And before he knew what was happening, he heard a deafening bang and he heard his friends screaming. Just minutes later, a police officer was flying down Interstate 80 in his cruiser. Eventually, he spotted a group of ambulances parked on the side of the road, and he knew that's where he needed to go, so he pulled over to the side and stopped. And when he got out, he saw in a ditch just off the highway was an overturned SUV. The officer immediately jumped out of his cruiser and rushed towards the vehicle. And when he got there, he found the scene was just absolutely chaotic. There were a team of paramedics who were at the window of the SUV trying to assess the condition of the victims inside and to get them out. And when the officer kneeled down to look inside as well, he could clearly see two people inside the vehicle. Now, both of them seemed basically fine beyond, obviously being in a wreck. I mean, they were banged up and clearly dazed, but their injuries didn't look immediately life-threatening. So, sort of relieved, the officer backed away to let the paramedics do their thing. But very quickly, the officer noticed that more paramedics were actually running past the SUV to something on the ground a few feet beyond it. And so the officer followed them to go see what it was they were running to. And when he saw what was on the ground, the officer just kind of stopped and knew instinctively that there was nothing anybody could do. I mean, there was a body of a young man on the ground who clearly was a third passenger of this SUV, but their body was just mangled almost beyond recognition. It would turn out Derek had been right. His September 17th, highly contentious column in the Daily Nebraskan would be his most controversial and famous piece ever. And actually, people are still talking about it today. Because his column was about how, we, all us Americans, reserve the right to make our own choices about our bodies and personal safety. And Derek believed that there was a law that was actually directly infringing on that right, which was the law that was forcing people to wear a seatbelt. Derek despised this requirement. He thought seatbelts should be just a personal decision about safety. To him, it was not just about buckling up, it was about individual choice, about freedom. And on January 4th, that SUV that Derek was riding in going back to school, well, the driver hit some ice on the road and lost control. The driver and the other passenger in the front were wearing seatbelts. But Derek, in keeping with his beliefs, was not. And so when the SUV crashed and flipped over, Derek alone was killed. As one reporter pointed out, Derek lived by his beliefs, and he also died by them. Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the West Coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you gotta act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballinstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballinstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all expenses paid for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's going to be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/Mr. Ballin. That is fandiem.com/Mr. Ballin. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. Just before 9 p.m. on Friday, January 13th, 2012, 51-year-old Francesco Schettino and his girlfriend, Domenica, sat at a table in a crowded restaurant at a resort in Italy. And they'd been there for a while, having a leisurely meal. So their table was covered with empty dishes, a wine decanter, and plates with the remnants of their amazing food. Now, having an extended, indulgent dinner like this one was not technically allowed, since Francesco was actually working. But Francesco was not too worried about breaking what he considered to be a small rule, because he was not just some hired hand. I mean, he was in charge of this entire resort on Italy's Tuscan coast. And the resort was amazing. It was literally right out on the water and had thousands of guest rooms and 6 restaurants with over a dozen bars, a theater, multiple swimming pools, and there was even a casino. So it had really a huge capacity for guests. And right now, there were easily more than 3,000 people staying at this resort. And Francesco was, very proud to be the boss of this place, this unbelievable place. He actually had started working at this resort as a security guard, but he'd worked his way up to the very top. And now he'd been overseeing this property for about 6 years. And being a leader really worked well for his personality, because he loved being impressive and feeling important. He'd heard staff and former coworkers complain about how he was too over the top and a bit of a show-off, so he'd heard those things. But Francesco knew that really these people, they were just jealous. He was handsome, he had a great job, and he had 2 just beautiful, amazing women in his life when, some people didn't have any. And so now Francesco smiled at one of his girlfriends, Domenica, who sat across the table from him and enjoying the dessert they were sharing. Francesco was married, but recently, Domenica had become the most important woman in his life. She was a dancer, and to him, she was just perfect. They'd only met a few weeks ago, so they were still in the honeymoon phase, where they were both still very flirtatious and eager to impress one another. And so right now, Francesco knew he should leave and get back to his managing duties, but he was having so much fun with Domenica, so he lingered, eating his dessert as slowly as he could. But as he sat there, slow playing his dessert, he realized, their night together didn't actually have to end just because the dinner was over. there was something he could do right now that would give them maybe another hour or so together. And it would also completely blow Dominica away and prove to her just how amazing he really was. So suddenly, with a big smile on his face, he told Dominica to hurry up, finish eating, because they needed to get upstairs immediately. A few minutes later, Francesco and Dominica hurried into the resort's top floor operations center. And just like the entire rest of the place, this room, despite being an operations center, was still just massively impressive. In addition to all the very new age, high-speed monitors and security feeds and maps all over the room, there was this huge window that overlooked this balcony, this exterior balcony, that looked down on the ocean. It was like this beautiful view of the ocean, and it even overlooked a stretch of small seaside villages called Giglio. This room was also filled with all of Francesco's employees hustling around and, staring at screens and talking on headsets. But as soon as Francesco and Dominica walked in there, Francesco kind of went to the center of the room and kind of got everybody's attention and told them all to listen up. Then he went over the details of his big idea. The resort was going to put on a very specific and spectacular kind of show called a salute. And they were going to do it right now. So salutes were very popular in this area of Italy, and Francesco's resort actually did them all the time, so this was not totally unusual. They were basically kind of a performance, mostly for the locals, where the resort would flash all of its lights and play music, while guests of the resort would go to their balconies and wave and cheer to the residents and the other tourists in Giglio. But critically, salutes needed to be both quick and highly choreographed. That's really the only way they worked. And so in order for a salute to work, it really required the attention and active participation from a large number of people. This was a big to-do. And so given the fact that these were sort of a big endeavor, it meant that, something could go wrong if you're not really careful. And Francesco actually had a mentor who'd actively discouraged him to not do these salutes or try to do as few as you can because of the fact that things could go wrong. But Francesco's mentor was not physically here right now to tell Francesco to stop. And the people that were here were pretty excited about his idea. So Francesco began going over the plan with his staff. And as he expected, with such a complicated undertaking, there were a lot of logistics to look over. However, when Francesco actually started going about these preparations, he realized he couldn't actually read anything because he didn't have his glasses on. He didn't think he looked handsome with them on, so he hadn't brought them out to dinner with Dominica, but now he really needed them. But thinking on his feet, Francesco simply asked a staff member to read him whatever information he really needed to know in order to do this salute. And so the staff member did as they were told, and at the end of it, Francesco felt like he had heard what he needed to hear and he thought everything was in order, and so he nodded and said, "Okay, we are all set to begin." And then he looked over at Dominica and smiled and sort of nodded like, "Okay, here we go." Then she knew whatever was coming next was going to be really, really special. When Francesco gave the actual order to begin the salute, everybody in the operations room jumped into action. And as soon as the actual salute began, Francesco squinted out the huge window that looked out over the ocean and Giglio down below, and Francesco was just so excited when he thought about how everyone who was out and about in town would look up and see his palace all lit up and full of life and energy. But as he peered at the lights of Giglio, he realized something wasn't quite right. Even without his glasses on, he could see that there was something outside in the darkness, just barely illuminated by the town's lights. It was a large shape right between the resort and Giglio. And to his horror, Francesco realized it was actually getting closer, fast. At the same time, but on the other side of the resort, an American man named Brian Aho was eating dinner with his wife and teenage daughter at the Milano restaurant, which was one of 6 restaurants in the resort. And they'd just been enjoying their meal when there was this deafening banging sound, and the entire room gave a huge jolt, and everything inside just sort of went flying. Brian grabbed the table to brace himself as plates and glasses shot off the table and shattered everywhere. And then he heard screams and people hitting the ground all around him as diners were literally being thrown from their chairs. And then there was another series of crashes when some ceiling panels fell from above and smashed onto the ground. But then it was over. The shaking abruptly stopped, and Brian immediately jumped up to make sure that his wife and daughter were okay, and they did seem fine, just dazed like everybody else in the room. As Brian stood up, he could tell he was, mostly okay, also shaken up. But the overwhelming thought was just having no idea what had just happened. I mean, he's looking around and no one seemed to know. It had felt like some kind of earthquake or something. But then Brian thought, if this had been an earthquake, he really had to get his family out of this restaurant immediately in case of aftershocks. But it seemed like all the other diners clearly had the same idea, because before Brian could actually move, there was a surge of activity around him as dozens of people just began rushing towards the exit of the restaurant. And Brian didn't want him or his family to get caught in the middle of this huge crowd. Huge amounts of people running in the exact same direction, a panicked group of people, could easily create a stampede. And he was worried that he and his family could get pulled to the ground and trampled in the chaos. So he looked around and he saw on the other side of the restaurant there was a smaller door that nobody else was going to. So he and his family began making their way over to it. But before they could actually get through this door, the overhead lights began to flicker and then went out. And then with the darkness, suddenly came the blast of emergency alarms echoing through the resort. And then he could hear more screams, not just inside of this restaurant, but sort of all over the place. It was like the resort had devolved into madness. Brian had never been more scared in his whole life. I mean, his pulse was racing faster than he thought was even possible, and he almost felt paralyzed, like this was just too much to even process. He also, like basically everybody else, had no clue what was going on here. But I mean, navigating his family through an emergency was already going to be horrifying and terrifying and dangerous, but now he would also have to do it in the dark. For a moment, Brian and his family just stood there, kind of frozen in the dark. And then Brian was about to tell his family to just go through the door, we'll figure it out in the dark. But then luckily, the emergency lights came on, giving the room sort of a dim, eerie glow. But it was enough to sort of guide their way. And so at that point, Brian didn't wait. He grabbed his wife and his daughter, pushed through the side door, and headed out into the hallway. It would take nearly 10 minutes for Brian and his family to navigate the maze of hallways they had just walked into until finally they stepped outside and were in the open air. But when they finally got out there, Brian realized they actually had a really big problem, because the exit they had just taken had taken them not to safety. It had led them to this expansive outdoor terrace with a railing on the 4th floor of the resort, which meant they still needed to get down multiple levels in order to, evacuate safely. But just the fact they were on the 4th floor was not the big issue. The big issue was the terrace was clearly packed with other people from the resort who were also trying to evacuate. There was all these people basically blocking their way. So basically, everybody who has no idea what's going on is just like pushing and shoving each other, and there were no authority figures or any staff around to actually direct what now was basically an evacuation. And Brian could tell that the crowd was clearly starting to panic, and really he was too. Everybody was just like, what's happening here? And so Brian was about to suggest to his family that they try to find another way out when they heard the crackling of the resort's public speaker system, and a voice came on that finally delivered some information about what was happening. It said that there had been an electrical blackout, but everything was fine, and technicians were hard at work trying to fix the problem. So in the meantime, all the guests should stay calm and just go to their rooms for safety. And at this point, it was very obvious that the mood all around Brian and his family completely changed. People stopped pushing and arguing and panicking, and Brian himself felt that knot of dread in his stomach sort of loosen a bit. I mean, an electrical blackout didn't seem like a life or death situation, so he, and clearly everybody else, felt a whole lot less scared. Pretty much right away, many of the guests began heading back inside, making their way to their rooms. And Brian actually spotted a few staff members who were in the crowd, encouraging people to do just that, go back to your rooms. And so for a few moments, Brian and his family and the others just kind of stayed put and just kind of let things play out, kind of watching things settle back into normal. But then it was like with no warning, there was this other huge banging sound, and the floor once again buckled under Brian's feet.
And this triggered a whole new wave of just absolute chaos out on this terrace. All at once, everybody started shouting and pushing each other in pure panic. And at the same time, there were all these new announcements coming out frantically over the loudspeaker, but it wasn't doing anything. It was like the crowd had decided something bad is happening and no one can tell me otherwise. I have to leave. Everybody is just trying to evacuate all at once. And so pretty much right at this point, you had a group of people who were out on the terrace who decided to charge into the resort to try to find another way to evacuate. And also you had the group of people who had already gone back inside to go back to their rooms, who had changed their mind, who charged right back out, back onto the terrace. And so for a moment, it was like these two pools of people kind of smashing into each other, and Brian and his family were kind of off to the side because they had just barely stepped out onto the terrace when all of this stuff was happening. But then Brian watched in complete shock as he saw some of the people, after they pushed through all the way to the edge of the terrace to the railing, they began climbing over the railing to climb down from the 4th floor. Seeing this was horrifying for Brian. But then he felt yet another shudder under his feet and a loud industrial groaning sound from the resort right behind him. And he knew if he didn't do what these people were doing, he and his family might not be able to evacuate. Clearly, there was a real problem. They didn't know what it was, but they had to go. So he grabbed his wife and his daughter's hands. He shoved his way through the crowd to the railing. Over the railing they went, and down they began to climb. Meanwhile, back up in the top-level operations center, Francesco was staring out the room's huge window, just completely frozen in shock. His resort was in complete pandemonium. Below, guests were running, others were fighting and shoving, and some were literally leaping to their potential deaths from the upper-level balconies and terraces. And so as Francesco watched all of this carnage, he tried to wrap his head around how the night had gone so horrifically wrong. The worst part of all of it was there was absolutely no way to fix it. He'd been trying to show Dominica and everybody else how amazing and impressive and in control he was, but he'd completely lost control of this whole situation. And he'd also lost his girlfriend because Dominica had quickly fled the resort. And then there was a loud crashing sound somewhere in the distance, and his heart pounded, and he realized it was time for him to start running too. Minutes later, Francesco and some of his staff sprinted through the halls of the resort. And as they ran, thunderous noises and bangs came from every direction, and debris from the ceiling and walls crashed to the ground all around them as they were shaken loose. And all the while, over the noise, Francesco could hear the continuous shrieks of panic from people who were still clearly trapped inside the resort and just couldn't get out. But he and the others he was with finally did make it to the exit. And this exit was not overrun with panicking people. So Francesco was lucky enough to be able to pretty quickly make it to the bottom level and then keep on going. And he did not look back, not until he was far away and definitely to safety. But when he did finally stop running, and he did turn around and looked back at his resort, his stomach pitched so hard he nearly vomited. Because finally, he could see right in front of him the full, horrible extent of what he had done. It would turn out what Francesco was looking at was the culmination of a record number of terrible choices he had made that night. 1. Francesco would later deny this, but he was seen drinking alcohol at dinner while he was supposed to be working. 2. He was not wearing his glasses, which meant he was his most handsome self, but also that he couldn't see very well. And 3. He was distracted by his new girlfriend, who he had brought to an area where only key personnel were allowed because he was desperate to impress her. Now, in most workplaces, this would all just be considered unprofessional and maybe might get you fired. But in Francesco's workplace, it was much worse than that. What he had done was incredibly dangerous because the resort that Francesco managed was not a regular hotel. It was a gigantic cruise ship called the Costa Concordia. Francesco was its captain, and when he issued the order for the boat to do a salute, he was not just ordering a complicated but entertaining show. A cruise ship salute also involves steering the massive boat much closer to shore than usual to appropriately show off to the locals on land. But because Francesco literally couldn't see very well, was obviously distracted and possibly drunk, he didn't notice that when they did this salute, they were going way too fast and way too close to shore. That shape he saw rushing towards them in the darkness was an enormous cluster of rocks. By the time he saw it, it was too late. The Concordia had smashed into the rocks, tearing a 230-foot wide hole in the hull, which immediately flooded the ship. And then, making matters even worse, Francesco delayed rescue efforts for more than an hour by trying to convince people that what had happened was just an electrical outage. And then when he finally did issue an evacuation order, he broke a sacred rule for ship captains. He fled the boat before the remainder of his crew and the passengers. Like he was the first one off. He did not go down with his ship. That American passenger, Brian Aho, and his family would survive, because after they decided to go over the railing, they, perilously climbed down 4 levels all the way to a lifeboat, and so they survived. But unfortunately, 32 other people who were on board the boat ultimately died, all because of Francesco's desire to show off. Francesco himself was ultimately arrested for manslaughter and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He was subsequently named Italy's most hated man. In the early morning hours of Saturday, March 29, 1997, a blonde 26-year-old waitress named Kim Medlin carried a tray of filet mignon through a topless bar in Charlotte, North Carolina, while wearing a leotard and tights. She made her way through the cigar smoke-filled room, past the stage where all the half-naked women were busy pole dancing. Kim worked here at the men's club 3 or 4 nights a week, and for the most part, she liked the job. It paid well, and by working the night shift, it left her days free, so she could focus on her 2 real passions, which were taking care of her horses and decorating her brand new house. So Kim and her husband Bridger had recently bought a 7-acre plot of land outside the nearby town of Monroe, where Bridger had actually grown up. They'd spent the past year building their dream home, including a barn for their 3 horses, and now that the construction was done, they had finally started moving in and decorating. Now, as Kim delivered the filet mignons to a table of middle-aged businessmen, she glanced over at the clock on the wall, and she felt a surge of excitement when she saw that there was less than an hour left in her shift. Kim had the next 3 days off, and she planned to use all that free time to finish some of the smaller moving projects that still needed to get done, like just unpacking boxes and hanging some pictures. So she flashed the businessmen a smile and then went to check on her other tables. An hour later, a little after 2 a.m., Kim walked out the back entrance of the bar, now wearing a baggy sweatshirt instead of her work uniform, and she called out a goodbye over her shoulder to some coworkers, and then walked over to where her red Jeep was parked along the side of the building. She got in, dropped her purse onto the cow print seat cover on the passenger seat, turned on the car, and then turned on some music for the hour-long drive home. A half an hour later, Kim drove south down Old Charlotte Highway, a secluded 2-lane road that was pretty much deserted at this hour. She used to find this commute kind of relaxing, but lately, it had been making her nervous to be driving alone late at night. And the reason for that was because a couple of weeks ago, while she was driving home from work around this same time of night, she'd been involved in a really scary road rage incident. Another vehicle had come up from behind and started tailgating her and honking their horn at her repeatedly for really no apparent reason. Kim had been afraid that this was a customer from the men's club who was now following her home, and it freaked her out so much that she'd actually pulled over into a convenience store parking lot because she saw there was a police car parked in there as well, and so she'd gone right over to the officer to ask for help. He'd promised to go and try and track down this road rager, and he'd even sent out a broadcast over the police radio, telling all the other officers to keep an eye out for Kim's car on the night she was working in case anyone gave her more trouble. And so now, even though, that road rager had never been caught, Kim did feel better knowing that the police had her back. But again, because the road rager had not been caught, she was still a bit scared about driving home alone. So tonight, to calm her nerves, she fished out her cell phone out of her purse and just called her husband, Bridger. When he answered, he told her that he was actually on the road too. He was still driving back from a gig DJing at a prom in a town 2 hours away, but he was almost home. After chatting for a few minutes, Bridger told Kim that he was actually pulling into their driveway and that he would call her right back once he got inside the house. So Kim said fine and said goodbye, and they hung up, and she kept on driving. Then, about 15 minutes later, so a little before 3 a.m., her phone rang,
And it was Bridger again, calling back like he had promised he would. And he asked Kim if she was close, and she told him that she was just passing by Union Station Restaurant, which meant she was maybe about 20 minutes away from home. Bridger said he was pretty tired and he was getting ready for bed, and in case he was asleep by the time she got in, he wished her goodnight. And Kim said goodnight back, and then she hung up, and she put her phone down on the passenger seat. But just as Kim turned her attention back towards the road, a sudden bright light almost blinded her. She looked in the rearview mirror and saw headlights right behind her. About an hour later, Kim's husband Bridger sat up in bed and looked over at the clock on his nightstand. It was 3:59 a.m., an hour after having spoken to Kim. I mean, she should have been home 20 minutes after that phone call, and she still wasn't back. So he got out of bed and he checked every room in their two-story house, but Kim wasn't in any of them. There was no sign of her. Then Bridger looked out the window and he saw her Jeep wasn't in the driveway either. So at this point, he hurried into the kitchen and he picked up the phone and he dialed Kim's cell phone number. And it rang a few times, and then a strange male voice answered. Bridger asked who he was speaking to, and the man told him he was a police officer with the Monroe Public Safety Department. Bridger asked him, okay, well, where's my wife? And the officer told him that he didn't know. He had just come across a red Jeep idling on the side of the road and found this phone inside of it, and it was ringing, and so he answered it. But he said, there's nobody here. Several minutes later, so this is a little bit after 4 a.m. on March 29, 1997, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk, a police investigator with the Monroe Public Safety Department, drove north along Old Charlotte Highway. He drove his patrol car past parking lots and houses until he reached the very edge of town. And finally, he saw what he was looking for: a red Jeep parked along the opposite side of the road, with another patrol car parked right behind it. He pulled a U-turn and parked on the shoulder, and as he got out of his car, he recognized Captain David Simpson standing there, waiting for him. Simpson told Chief Hulk that he had just found this Jeep idling on the side of the road about 15 minutes ago with its headlights on, and he had walked up. There had been nobody inside of it, but when he looked in, there was a cell phone, and it began to ring. And so, acting on instinct, he answered the phone, and it was a man named Bridger Medlin who was calling saying, I'm looking for my wife. This is her phone. She hasn't come home. And Captain Simpson also said that he actually recognized this Jeep from a random run-in he had had 2 weeks earlier outside of a convenience store with Kim Medlin. And so he put it together and he's like, okay, Bridger's calling. This is definitely Kim's car, but Kim's nowhere to be found. And Hulk actually recognized Kim's name because he actually happened to be friends with Kim's husband, Bridger. And so he pulled out his flashlight and he began looking inside the Jeep, and right away, he saw there was a wallet lying open on the passenger seat. And when he looked inside the wallet, there were credit cards, there was cash, but there was like this clear section of the wallet where obviously you would slide your driver's license, and there was nothing there. So it very much looked like her license had been pulled out on purpose. Now, their initial theory was, okay, well, maybe Kim got pulled over by a police officer and took out her license to hand to the cop. But in a department as small as Monroe's, there were only a few officers on duty at this time of night. And when Assistant Chief Hulk asked Captain Simpson, had any of the on-duty officers pulled anybody over that night, Simpson was already all over it. He had checked. And he said, no, none of our officers pulled anybody over. So this made Hulk wonder if maybe Kim had been pulled over by somebody posing as a cop. There had actually been dozens of reports over the years of so-called blue light bandits pretending to be police officers in order to harass drivers, especially young women. But those cases were really quite rare, even though they did happen. So Hulk didn't want to jump to any conclusions quite yet. Just then, Hulk heard a truck engine and saw headlights approaching up the highway. So he set the wallet back down on the seat and then walked over to where a black pickup truck was now pulling to a stop right behind Hulk's car. A tall man with blonde hair got out of the driver's seat, and right away Hulk knew who it was. It was his friend and Kim's husband, Bridger. And Bridger looked frantic, and he demanded to know what had happened to his wife. But Hulk told him to calm down, that they were here to try to figure out what happened to his wife and where she went. Hulk went on to say that, look, we showed up and we just found her car here. But there were no broken windows or slashed tires or any sign of a struggle, so it was possible that maybe Kim just ran into car trouble and maybe she went out to go find help. But then, without asking for permission, Bridger pushed past Hulk and just climbed right inside of the Jeep's driver's seat and said, "Well, let's test your theory right now and see whether the car was working." Hulk told him to get out of the Jeep, but Bridger just totally ignored him, and then he put his wife's car in drive and moved it forward a few inches. Then he put it in reverse, and he drove it backward, ultimately parking it in its original place, showing that it worked just fine. And even though at this point Hulk was kind of annoyed with Bridger for what he had just done, he couldn't help but think, this is bad, something's going on here. And so Hulk walked over to his car, and he radioed the dispatcher for reinforcements. And he asked them to bring a police dog so they could try to track Kim's scent in case she left on foot. A few minutes later, 2 more police cars pulled up to the scene, and a few officers and a police dog got out. Hulk opened the doors to the Jeep, and the dog went in and sniffed around, getting familiar with the scent of Kim's belongings. Then the dog seemed to pick up a trail on the ground, and so the officers told Bridger, who clearly wanted to go with them, to stay put, stay with your truck, and then they followed the dog down the road for about 100 yards or so until it turned onto a driveway. Hulk and the others followed the dog up this long driveway towards a small house nestled in the trees right off the highway, and the dog sniffed all the way up to the garage and then stopped. That was where Kim's trail ended, and so Hulk went up to the house and rang the doorbell, and a minute later, a man answered, and despite the late hour, he looked totally awake and not particularly surprised to see cops at his door. Hulk asked the man who he was and whether or not he had seen or heard anything unusual in the past couple of hours near his property. The man said his name was Nathan Hargett, and about an hour ago, so maybe around 3:45 a.m., he'd been woken up by a strange car loitering near his garage. Nathan said he hadn't recognized the car, but he noticed that it had Texas plates, and that there also had been a woman with blonde hair in the back seat. Hulk asked Nathan for permission to search his property, and Nathan told them to go right ahead. And so Hulk directed the other officers to search the inside of the house, while he clicked on his flashlight and headed over to the garage. When he got there, he turned the handle of a door on the side of the garage, and he found it was unlocked. So he pushed the door open, and he shined his flashlight inside, but all he saw was a truck and some gardening tools. There was no sign of Kim. By the time dawn broke around 6 a.m. that morning, this had become officially a missing persons case. So police began a search of the woods around the Old Charlotte Highway with help from members of the community. Meanwhile, Hulk and Simpson went back to the station to speak to one of the dispatchers who had been on duty that night. After speaking to that homeowner, Nathan, and searching his house and his garage, he had been ruled out as a suspect. So now they were focused on finding that car with the Texas plates that Nathan had seen loitering outside of his garage. So they were hoping that maybe there was a report of a traffic stop or maybe a suspicious car in the area or anything that might help figure out who was driving that car. But the dispatcher said again that really there had been no stops, nothing that night. However, there had been one incident in the area that night. It was around 2 a.m., so it was about an hour before Kim was last heard from. They'd gotten a call about a car that had run into a ditch not too far from where Kim's Jeep was found. Hulk asked who had responded to that call, and the dispatcher said it was car 491, which was driven by a young rookie officer named Josh Griffin. Hulk immediately gave Officer Griffin a phone call and asked if he had seen or heard anything unusual while he was out responding to that car in the ditch. But Griffin said no. He actually said that his shift was over around the time that driver had flagged him down for help, so he had actually just called for a tow truck, and when it got there, maybe a little bit after 2:30 a.m., Griffin said he just went home. Hulk hung up the phone feeling pretty disappointed. Bridger said the last time he heard from his wife Kim was around 3 a.m., so if this car was already being towed away by 2:30 a.m., then it definitely was not the same car that Nathan saw loitering outside of his garage, and the driver of that car in the ditch was likely not a suspect. Hulk sighed in frustration, but then another idea occurred to him. He asked Captain Simpson to elaborate on that random run-in he had had with Kim a couple of weeks earlier. Now, this was sort of a long shot to bring it up again, but Hulk wondered if maybe the same driver from the road rage incident could have maybe come back and, maybe chased Kim off the road or something. Simpson said he would go dig up the report that he had filed on the incident, and then he left to go find it. About half an hour later, Hulk sat at his desk reading through a copy of the road rage police report. It said that in the very early morning hours of Saturday, March 15th, so exactly 2 weeks before Kim's disappearance, Kim had pulled into a convenience store and flagged down Captain Simpson and another officer named Roger Griffin. So Officer Josh Griffin is the one who responded to the car stuck in the ditch. Officer Roger Griffin is actually Josh's father, and he was with Captain Simpson that night. So the report said that Simpson and his partner, Roger Griffin, had actually caught up with the car that was harassing Kim a little bit further down the road. There were two men inside the car, Eric Williams and George Connell, and they claimed that they thought Kim was actually the one harassing them by flashing her lights at them. And so to Simpson and to Griffin, it seemed like a big misunderstanding, so the officers had just let them go. But Hulk, now looking at this through a very different lens, felt like he needed to speak to Eric and George regardless. And so in the report, he found the contact information for Eric and George, and he called them both up. But it turned out they both had airtight alibis for the night of Kim's disappearance. But even still, it struck Hulk as very odd that Kim had gone missing from her car on the same road at the same time of night and on the same night of the week as the road rage incident just 2 weeks earlier. And he had a hard time believing it was all just, one big coincidence. The next day, just after sunset on Sunday, March 30th, Hulk drove down Westwood Industrial Drive, a deserted dead-end street at the edge of town, about 2 miles from where Kim's Jeep was found. And as he was driving, he saw at the end of the street there were a couple of police cars parked there. And so he pulled his own car behind them, and he got out. He walked into the trees where he could see the beams of several flashlights moving around in the darkness. And as he got closer, he saw officers putting up police tape around a small clearing. And then, on the ground in that clearing, he saw a pair of feet in sneakers poking out from underneath a pile of roofing shingles and branches. The police had gotten a call earlier that evening from two men who were part of the community search effort for Kim, and they said to police that they had found a body in the woods in this spot, but they hadn't touched it. And so now with Hulk on the scene, the forensics team removed the shingles and branches that were covering the body, and Hulk pulled out his flashlight and knelt down to get a better look. And he saw right away it was a deceased woman, and it was definitely Kim Medlin. She was only wearing a pair of shorts, a bra, and a sweatshirt that had been pulled up over her head. One side of her face was very badly beaten, and there were also cuts and bruises all over her neck, and there were some scrapes on her knees. And her necklace and wedding ring were still on, so her killer had not robbed her. Hulk stood back as the forensics team untangled Kim's sweatshirt from around her wrists so they could collect clippings of her fingernails, in case she had maybe scratched off a trace of her killer's DNA. And as Hulk watched one of these forensics officers go to put the sweatshirt inside of an evidence bag, he suddenly noticed something and shouted for the officer to stop. Hulk stepped closer and he shined his flashlight on the sweatshirt's fabric, and it revealed a shoe print. And so he told the officers to send that sweatshirt to the crime lab and see if they could figure out the size and type of shoe that had left that print. But while he would have to wait for those results, he knew he had a couple of other big clues to help narrow down a suspect. The first was the location of Kim's body. Westwood Industrial Drive was known as Lover's Lane, so basically a secluded, out-of-the-way spot where people often went to be alone. And the fact that Kim's killer had thought to take her there meant they were probably a local and familiar with the area. Now, it was still theoretically possible that she'd just been run off the road by some stranger for some reason, or, maybe a customer had followed her home from work, or maybe it was a blue light bandit impersonating a police officer. But the second big clue was that there was no sign of a struggle at Kim's Jeep. And because of that, Hulk did not think she had been kidnapped by a stranger. He thought it was far more likely that she had gotten out of her car for somebody that she knew and trusted. The very next day, Monday, March 31st, Hulk sat down in an interrogation room with his friend and first murder suspect, Kim's husband, Bridger. Bridger had been really pushy and really in some ways over-involved in the investigation from literally the moment Kim's Jeep was found. He'd messed with the crime scene by getting into the Jeep without permission, and now Hulk had information that Bridger had lied about his alibi. So when Kim first went missing, Bridger had told the police that he got home around 2:30 that morning, he called Kim for a brief chat a little before 3, and then he immediately went to bed. But now, a police officer had told Hulk that he had seen Bridger's black pickup truck driving around the center of town around 2:30 a.m., which was nowhere near Bridger's house, and nowhere near the route he would have taken to get back from his DJing gig. So once Hulk sat down, immediately he could see that Bridger was visibly distraught. I mean, he's just learned that his wife was found dead, but Hulk had a job to do. And so he cut right to the chase. And he said to Bridger that, hey, this other officer said they saw your truck driving around in town. It contradicts your alibi. Why did you lie? And right away, Bridger exploded. He was so mad. And he shouted at Hulk that he couldn't believe at a time like this, you would accuse me of lying to you? You're insinuating that I hurt my wife? I didn't do this. He also yelled at Hulk for just wasting time looking at him as a suspect when there were so many clues pointing to a different story, like the lack of a struggle at the Jeep and the rolled down window and missing driver's license, all of which made it look like a traffic stop gone wrong. Bridger said he knew Kim better than anybody, and she would never, ever get out of her car in the middle of the night for a stranger, especially after that road rage incident 2 weeks earlier. She was on edge. She never would have done that. When Hulk left the interrogation room a few minutes later, he told his team to track down security footage from around town on the night Kim was killed to see if there was proof that really Bridger was driving around when he said he was home. Because right now they had no evidence to show he was lying, and they actually just had to let Bridger go. But when Bridger was leaving, he'd been so angry and so defensive, it sort of made Hulk think that maybe Bridger did this. And in fact, the fact that Bridger had brought up that his wife would never have gotten out of the car in the middle of the night for a stranger, well, that only reinforced that she might have gotten out of the car for you, Bridger, because she knew and trusted you. But also, Hulk was thinking that another person or group of people that Kim might have gotten out of the car for would be police. Now, Hulk already knew that there were no police that pulled anybody over that night, but somebody could have pretended to be a police officer, a blue light bandit. That was a theory that did sort of make sense. Hulk thought about that bulletin that had gone out over the police radio 2 weeks ago, telling officers to be on the lookout for Kim's Jeep at certain times of the night because of that road rage incident. Now, police radios were not private, so anybody with a police scanner could have been listening in, and what they would have heard is, well, around this time of the night, this woman, Kim, often drives this road all by herself. And they basically could have just been waiting for her, knowing she was vulnerable. So Hulk picked up his phone and he began calling around to other police departments in the region. And he actually found out there had been 2 separate reports of blue light bandits harassing women recently. Now, one of the culprits had already been caught, and he was in jail when Kim was killed, so it could not have been him. But the other suspect still hadn't been found. A couple of days later, on April 4th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk slammed down the phone in frustration and crossed another name off a list on his notepad. It had been 5 days since Kim's body was found, and all the leads he'd had at the start of the investigation were now coming back as dead ends. When he tracked down surveillance footage from the night of Kim's disappearance, there was no sign of her husband Bridger's truck driving through town until 4 a.m., after Kim's Jeep had been found by police. So the officer who claimed to have seen Bridger's truck driving around at 2:30 did appear to have been mistaken, as Bridger said. Hulk also had reached out to Kim's manager and co-workers at the bar she worked at, thinking maybe her killer might have been a patron who followed her home. But none of them knew of any problems she had had with customers. Meanwhile, Hulk's team had spoken to a man who worked the night shift at a business that was near where Kim's Jeep had been found. He said he had left work a little before 3 a.m. on the night that Kim disappeared. And as he was waiting to turn onto Old Charlotte Highway, he had seen her red Jeep go past. And right afterwards, he saw another car that was going in the other direction make a sort of sudden, sharp 3-point turn and speed right after the Jeep. The man had said that this other car had lights on the roof and reflective tape on the rear, and he thought, or at least assumed, it was a police car, but he didn't get a good look at the markings. Now, Hulk knew that every single Monroe police officer that was on duty that night was accounted for, and they hadn't pulled anybody over at the time that Kim went missing. However, this new information certainly did support the theory that maybe Kim's killer was posing as a police officer, that they were a blue light bandit. So Hulk had spent the past couple of days trying to track down witnesses who had seen that other blue light bandit who was recently reported in a nearby town but had never been caught, but he kept coming up dry. Nobody knew anything that could help track down that suspect. So it seemed like the investigation was really starting to slow down. But then Hulk's phone rang, and he answered it, and it was an expert from the forensics lab who had just finished analyzing that shoe print that had been found on Kim's sweatshirt. And so Hulk leaned forward in nervous anticipation as the expert told him the results. And when he did, Hulk knew exactly how to find Kim's killer. Based on that shoe print, witness testimony, and other forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Kim Medlin on March 29, 1997. Around 3 a.m., the killer was driving down Old Charlotte Highway. They'd been prowling around for hours, pulling over young women for minor traffic infractions or sometimes for doing nothing wrong at all. And as they drove, they saw a familiar red Jeep pass by. The killer had seen that Jeep coming down this road several nights a week, and they'd sort of grown obsessed with the young blonde woman who was driving it. And now they decided it was finally time to do something about that. So they pulled an abrupt three-point turn and raced after the Jeep and flipped on their car's flashing lights. Pretty soon, the Jeep pulled over onto the shoulder, and the killer got out of their car and walked up to the driver's side window. The woman inside naturally rolled down the window, and she handed over her driver's license, which said her name was Kim Medlin. And then she politely asked what the problem was, and the killer just told her to get out of the car. Now, Kim was visibly confused, but she did as she was told. And once she was out of the car, the killer slapped a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists and then dragged her over to their car and tossed her in the back seat. Then the killer got in the driver's seat of their car as Kim began crying and insisting that she didn't do anything wrong. Why was she being arrested? But the killer wasn't listening. Their mind was racing as they realized that even though they'd been dreaming about this moment for weeks, they actually didn't really have a plan for what they would do next. And so after a moment, they pulled over and just idled for a minute while they figured out what their next move was going to be. And then an idea came to them. They put their car in drive and continued down the highway. And as they turned onto a secluded dead-end road, Kim in the back seat suddenly got very quiet. And so the killer picked up on that and looked in the rearview mirror and saw her moving around, fiddling with something behind her back. And the killer suddenly realized that in all their excitement, they'd forgotten to lock the rear doors. The killer immediately tried to lock their doors with the power locks, but before they could, the rear door opened and Kim jumped out of the moving car. And so the killer came to a hard stop, they leapt out of the car, and they ran back for Kim, who was lying in the middle of the road, her hands are still cuffed behind her, and without even thinking, the killer lifted up their flashlight, and they smashed it into Kim's head, and then they stomped on her back and broke her neck. But the killer wasn't done. They reached down and they put their flashlight around Kim's neck, basically put it up against her throat, and then they pulled back on their arms, basically creating sort of a noose around her neck with this flashlight. And they held it like that, and they pulled as tight as they could until Kim stopped moving. After that, they dragged her body off the road and into the woods, where they removed her handcuffs and covered her body with branches and debris to hide it. Then the killer went home and cleaned up their car, making sure there was no evidence that would tie them to the murder. But they didn't realize they had actually left behind one crucial piece of evidence at the scene, that shoe print on Kim's sweatshirt. The print had a very distinct V-shaped pattern on the tread, which made it very easy to identify. And so weeks later, the forensics lab traced that print back to a shoe that was made by the Thorogood Company, a supplier of military and uniform footwear. And that particular model happened to be the exact same shoe issued to officers in the Monroe Public Safety Department, which meant Kim's killer was not just posing as a police officer. They were a police officer. The killer was Officer Josh Griffin, the off-duty rookie cop who had responded to a car in a ditch about a half an hour before Kim went missing. It would turn out Josh had learned the details about Kim's vehicle and late-night driving patterns from his father, Officer Roger Griffin, after his father told him about that road rage incident that he and Captain Simpson had responded to on March 15th. And so Josh had basically been on the lookout for Kim's Jeep ever since. Josh Griffin was arrested on May 30th, 1997, about 2 months after Kim's murder. He was eventually convicted of first-degree kidnapping and murder and sentenced to life in prison. As for his motive, the best we can offer is he became obsessed with Kim and attacked her.